The dust of the road billows around the girls' feet as they walk. It's so hot that the small smattering of rain that comes at night is nowhere near enough to meld the top layer of soil to the ground. The girls laugh and talk animatedly, their towels slung over their shoulders. Cries of joy coming from the children in the swimming pool echo in the distance. Then a car rumbles to a stop beside them. When it pulls off again, the girls are gone. All that's left is their footprints in the dirt on the side of the road. It's the beginning of the end, and also just the start of a whole new world of pain and grief for so many more. This is True Crime South Africa. I'm Nicole Engelbrecht, and you're listening to Part 1 of the murders of Petro Nel and Issie Fourie. This episode and its parts are part of a special collaboration with KykNet around their recent true crime drama series, Niggies. The series is based on the true life events around the murders of two young cousins and how their murders changed multiple families and a community over many decades. In these episodes, I'll be covering these murders in my standard True Crime South Africa format. With this case being so old, it's very likely I never would have been able to cover this on my own, because it's simply so difficult to access information going back so far. KykNet's own research has been invaluable to me, and it was an incredible experience to be able to look through all of this really old documentary evidence and piece together the puzzle of this crime. These murders may have occurred many, many decades ago, but I couldn't help but acknowledge as I worked on this project how the case still represents the bare-faced truth of violent crime and how it has a deep impact on families throughout generations. So with that said, let's get into Part 1 of the murders of Petro Nel and Issie Fourie.
The following episode may contain sensitive material, including descriptions of violence, sexual assault, or graphic descriptions of injuries to victims. If you feel you may be triggered by such material, please consider this before accessing our content. To access trauma counseling or services, please see the helpline information on our show notes.
Henning and Ossis Nel met and married in 1944 in the Orange Free State. Ossis's real name was Petronella Dorothea, a family name passed down through several generations in her family of origin, the Fouries. But as is often the case in families in which generational names are used, each individual has their own nickname to distinguish them, and Ossis became hers. In 1945, Ossis gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl named Machteld and David. 4 years later, another daughter, Hendrina, who would be affectionately known as Henda, joined the family, and in early 1952, Ossis gave birth to a son named Andries. Later that same year, though, tragedy struck the Nel family for the first time, when twins Machteld and David both contracted polio. Poliomyelitis, commonly shortened to polio, is an infectious disease caused by the polio virus. In about 75% of cases, patients do not show any symptoms, but mild symptoms can occur, including sore throat and fever, and in some cases, more severe symptoms develop, such as headache, neck stiffness, and paresthesia. A less common symptom is permanent paralysis and possible death in extreme cases. However, this view of the disease is a modern one. And in the early 1950s, the vaccine for polio was only just being developed, and medical services were, of course, certainly not what they are today. So many cases were quite severe at that time, and those who survived often lived with a legacy of at least one area of paralysis in their body. The Nel twins were isolated after their polio was diagnosed to protect their siblings. And while David took the treatment well and made a full recovery, Machteld did not. And she sadly passed away on the 27th of December 1952. The Nel family was devastated, and Osis would later say that she'd begged God that day to please bless her with another little girl, just like Machteld. Within 3 months, Osis was with child. And just 5 days before the 1-year anniversary of Machteld's death in 1953, Petronella Dorothea Nel was born on the 22nd of December. Osis says that Petronella, who would become known as Petro, looked identical to Machteld when she was born, and she was convinced that her prayers had been answered and her daughter had been returned to her. Even then, though, she would later say she harboured a deep feeling that her youngest child was not meant for this world, and her time with their family would be shorter than anyone anticipated. The Nel family had settled in Odendalsrus. They lived in a house large enough to accommodate their core family of 7, and there was also a cottage in the back where Henning's parents lived. Henda Nel would later say that she recalled being really happy in that house in the early years. Her parents were incredibly strict, she says, but there was love, and although they were far from rich, her dad's job as a driller on the nearby mines paid decently, and they never really wanted for much. The Nels, like many South African families at that time, retained relatively close ties with their extended family. Osis had 2 siblings, a brother named Dries and a sister named Max, both of whom were married and had children of their own, and the 3 families all kept in regular contact. Issie Fourie had married Mari around the same time his sister had married her husband. They would go on to have 2 children, Andre, who was born in 1950, and Margarita Isabella, who went by Issie, and was born on the 16th of April 1953. Issie was born quite underweight and spent the first 2 weeks of her life in an incubator. Dries, like his brother-in-law, worked as a driller for the mines, and although they too had originally lived in the Free State in the early 60s, Dries was recruited by a mining operation in Zambia, and the Fourie family went to live there. In Zambia, the Fouries lived in a mainly South African expat community in what was then called Bancroft and is now called Chilile Bombwe. As a country, Zambia, like many African countries, was colonized by Britain for many decades. When the Fourie family moved there in the early 1960s, independence was on the horizon for the country. And as was the case in South Africa, freedom came with a tumultuous atmosphere. Although the Fouries enjoyed living in Zambia for the most part, and Dries was earning very good money at the mines there, after independence was gained in 1964, the family decided that it would be best for them to start the move back to South Africa. The children had attended primary school in Zambia, but the Fouries thought it would be best to let them attend high school in South Africa, if their future plans meant that they would be moving back there anyway. In addition, incidents of crime were on the increase in Zambia, and Dries and Mari didn't feel entirely safe there anymore. In early 1966, the family made the final decision that the children would start school in South Africa in the new school year, and they began making arrangements to travel home. The move would be done in parts, with Maurie taking the children to South Africa to register them in school and start getting them settled, and then Dries would join them later on. This way, they felt they could enjoy the benefits of living in South Africa while still earning the higher rate of income Dries got from his post in Zambia, at least for a little while. The decision was made that the whole family would travel to South Africa for the Christmas period, though, and then Dries would travel back to Zambia. That Christmas, the Fouries, the Nels, and the Fouries, who I haven't introduced yet but will shortly, all travelled together to Kroonstad for a camping trip. The remaining family members, many years later, would clearly recall this trip as one of their best Christmases ever. Dries Fourie had opted to pay for a lot of the food and had ensured every child had several Christmas presents. The children spent their days playing together, and Petro and Issie, the two cousins who were the same age, didn't miss a beat after having not seen each other for so many years and instantly bonded again. It was the last time the families would be all together like that. They could have no idea, but in just a few days, all of their lives would be forever changed, and the blood ties that bound would be ruptured. At this point, I'll introduce you to the Fourie family, because although they were not direct victims of this crime, they play a pivotal role, and at least one member would be a significantly affected secondary victim for many years to come. The Fourie family consisted of Dries Fourie and Osis Nel's sister, Max, and her husband, Gustav Fourie. They had a son and a daughter called Poppy, and at the time of the camping trip and the events that followed, Max was pregnant with their third child. Gustav Fourie was a dairy farmer in Odendalsrus, and although his brother-in-law Dries had never really felt he was good enough for his sister, he had warmed slightly to the man over the years, to the point that they could spend time together well enough. As the camping trip came to an end, everyone except Dries returned to Odendalsrus, and he went back to Zambia. The Fouries had decided that settling back in Odendalsrus would be best, because they had family there, and the school they intended to send Andre and Issie to was not far from there. Before I steer away from Kroonstad, I must just mention a weird rabbit hole I went down, which, although not pertinent to the case in any way, really is quite strange in terms of how tragedy sometimes travels through families. While searching for information on the families involved, I came across a death notice for a 3-year-old girl who died of measles in the early 1900s. The child was a resident in a concentration camp in Kroonstad during the Second Anglo-Boer War. These camps were built to house Boers and African farm workers who had been displaced from their farms by the British scorched earth policy. Conditions in the camps were horrendous, and while the camp in Kroonstad only existed for 3 years, by the end of the war, it was estimated that 27,927 people had died in these camps across South Africa, with only 3,000 of those being adults. The rest were children. Now, both the Nel and the Fourie lines that I traced all have significant presence in the Free State area, and it's often easy to spot the common lineage because of those family names I mentioned earlier. The name of the little girl who died in the Kroonstad camp was Isabella Margriete Dorothea Fourie. It was a name that would clearly split up and then be passed down a long family lineage in both the Fourie and then the Nel families, when they joined through marriage. And if you've been a listener for a while, you know me and my rabbit holes by now, and how often I see these odd connections, which probably mean little materially, but are almost poetically tragic. So after hearing that Petro and Issie spent their last Christmas together in Kroonstad, I couldn't help but think about the tragic legacy of that. A little girl who had died long before her time, whose name continued to live on long after, tragically dying in the same place where almost 70 years later, when the original Isabella Margrieta Dorothea Fourie should have been an old lady, smiling over her grandchildren. The two young girls who bore parts of her name would spend some of their last moments of a carefree childhood before they, too, were unfairly ripped away. I always say that the places in which crimes occur often become like characters in the story, and it's no different in this case. Odendalsrus, as a town and a community, had played a huge role in all these families' lives, and would be equally momentously struck down when the worst happened in its midst. So I think it's important to at least understand some of the background of this town. Odendalsrus started out in 1912 as a collection of farms, as well as a central church, which eventually became a town. In April 1946, gold was discovered on the farm called Geduld, near Odendalsrus, and this started a decades-long relationship with mining in the town. By the 1960s, the town was very much based around the activities of mining, with most of the jobs provided for residents being in the mining sector. As the gold economy shifted and changed over that time, some of the many mining companies around town were bought out and some operations were shut down or merged into other operations. This resulted in a few abandoned mining operations scattered around the area, including what was known as Freddy's Mine, which had shut certain parts of its operations and left behind abandoned buildings scattered across Odendalsrus. The people of the town at that time were very much salt-of-the-earth individuals who worked hard and revolved their lives around the Dutch Reformed Church. Of course, the Group Areas Act, which had been implemented in the 1950s, had ensured that the population of the core of the town was mainly white, while black residents lived on the outskirts of the town, in a township called Kutulwanong. At the time, pass laws were also in place, which meant that any person of colour working in Odendalsrus had to be able to produce their passbook at any time to prove that their employer was local and they had been given permission to work in or move through the area. Some white employers had special permission to have their black staff members live on their property, if, for instance, they provided domestic cleaning services, or as with the Fourie family, Gustav, who had a young man who took care of his cattle, and he was allowed to live within the town limits for that purpose. As the new year dawned in Odendalsrus, the two cousins, Petro and Issie, spent most of their days together. School was due to start in 2 weeks, and the girls' mothers were preparing their uniforms. Everything was brand new for Issie and Andre, of course, because they'd be starting at a new school that year. Issie's brown school suitcase was all ready to go, with her name marked in white letters on the inside. When they weren't prepping for school, the girls spent their days dancing to music played on the record player, sitting out on the lawn on blankets, and occasionally, when allowed, cooling off at the local swimming pool. On the 10th of January 1966, Petro's older sister Henda had headed off to Johannesburg for a friend's funeral. The girls were at home with Issie's brother Andre and their cousin Poppy, and Uncle Gustav, who were at the house too, as Gustav was helping with something on one of the vehicles. The day was hot as usual, and it wasn't long until Petro and Issie were begging to be allowed to go to the swimming pool to cool down for a while. The girls' moms said they could only go if Andre went with them. Little Poppy, who was just 6 years old at the time, was very attached to her older cousin Petro, and when she heard the girls were going to the pool, she asked her dad, Gustav, if she could go with. Gustav said no. Poppy had been born with a heart condition, and she was never allowed to go swimming without adult supervision in case something happened while she was swimming. Poppy was upset, but soon found something else to keep her busy, and Petro and Issie changed into their swimming costumes with shorts and t-shirts over, grabbed their towels, and headed out with Andre at 1:30 p.m. The girls knew that they needed to be home well in time for dinner. As any 15-year-old boy, Andre was not particularly pleased at being appointed as babysitter for his sister and cousin, but he walked them to the swimming pool as he'd been instructed. When they arrived there, though, Andre decided it would be fine to leave them to their own few hours of fun, to do his own thing for a bit, and then he'd come back for them later on. The girls agreed, really not perturbed at all, I'm sure, that they didn't have their older brother and cousin standing sentry. Andre rode off on his bicycle and spent the next few hours exploring Odendalsrus. Shortly after the girls left, Gustav asked Poppy if she'd like to head out to the cattle kraal with him. For the most part, it was a distraction for the still disappointed Poppy, and although she'd been to the kraal with her father often, that day the very ordinary activity would stand out in her memory for decades to come. When father and daughter arrived at the kraal, Gustav set about carrying out the numerous chores essential to dairy farming. His operation was small, but he managed to provide many homes in the area with milk, and it was honest work. Poppy helped with small tasks around the kraal, and then around 4:30 p.m., screams echoed through the air. Both Poppy and Gustav heard them. And then Gustav realized it must be the wind carrying shouts from the children at the swimming pool, which lay in the same direction. He laughed to himself, thinking that the kids must really be having fun that day. Back at the Nel home around 5 p.m., family members began to arrive back home and preparations for dinner began. Soon, Andre arrived on his bicycle, his face a little flushed. He asked if Petro and Issie were home. He said he'd been to the swimming pool to collect them, and the gates were locked, and they were nowhere to be found. The girls had not arrived home, though, and the family's concern was immediate. Both girls were never known to get into trouble, and always home by curfew. The moms started to phone around to a few other family members and friends of the girls to see if they'd gone there. Tension grew in the home, and Andre and Henning began to drive around the streets to see if they could spot Issie and Petro. After 2 hours of searching, the families decided it was time to call in the police. But their initial calls to the police station were fruitless, with the officer encouraging them to wait longer for the girls to come home before panicking. The families were not willing to wait, though, and soon a huge number of residents were walking the streets of Odendalsrus, calling Issie and Petro's names. By 8 p.m., Police realized it wouldn't do to have half the community out on the streets in the dark, and they called at the Nel home and began to take the girls' information down. The usual questions were asked. Were the girls known to run away? Did they have boyfriends? Was Issie upset about moving back to South Africa? Could she have gone off to sulk somewhere? The answer to all those questions was no. The Nels and the Fouries already deeply feared that something terrible had happened to their respective youngest daughters. For the next few hours, more than 80 police officers and countless townspeople, including several of the family members, continued to search the fields, streets, nooks and crannies of Odendalsrus. Eventually, many fell away, needing to get some rest before they could continue on again, hoping that perhaps, by the time the morning sun crept through their bedroom curtains the next day, the girls would be safely located and back home. But that was not to be. A group of men, including Issie Fourie, one of Petro's older brothers, David, and 2 other male family members, were searching open field areas in and around the town when they decided to check out the abandoned admin building of the old Freddy's South gold mine, which was near Gustav's cattle kraal. The building had not been used in years, but after the operation that used to run out of it had merged with another, the structure had fallen into disrepair, and homeless people would sometimes sleep in the building, so it was generally not somewhere anyone willingly went, unless, of course, you were searching for 2 missing girls, and then everywhere needed to be searched. There are actually 2 stories in existing evidence about why the men went into the building that night. One is that David Nel had approached a man who cared for the cattle and lived in a hut near the kraal to ask if he had seen or heard anything about the girls. The man said he hadn't, but he had noticed a light up at the abandoned admin building earlier, and this had prompted the search party to go to the building. The other version I found is that while they were searching the area, Gustav had suddenly remembered hearing children's screams earlier in the day, and although at the time he'd thought they were playful shouts coming from the swimming pool, at that moment he wondered whether he was mistaken, and perhaps they'd been coming from the abandoned building. Either way, the 4 men moved toward the building and began to first check the surroundings. The 2 glass front doors of the building had been broken, so the men carefully made their way inside. The interior of the building assailed their senses with smells. Homeless people who'd slept in the building over the years had urinated in corners, and a pervasive smell of urine and dust hung in the air. Undeterred and not willing to leave anywhere unsearched, the men persisted, slowly, methodically moving through the ground floor. They stepped over rubbish and discarded paperwork from the old mine, dodged hanging pieces of electrical wire, and swung their torch beams over the surfaces and into corners. Their hearts leapt out of their chest as a torch beam shone over one wall, in what at first glance appeared to be blood, but later turned out to be lipstick. The men saw scrawled initials and crudely drawn hearts and a naked figure of a person. The initials appeared to read YN, IN, and HF. Dread settled over the men, and although they could find no sign of the girls on the ground floor, they continued up the stairs to the first floor. There, they moved from room to room, until Issie Fourie let out a gasp. The other men rushed to where he stood, and there in the weak beam of his torchlight saw a sight that would never leave their memory. 12-year-old Petro Nel was laying on the concrete floor. Her hands were bound in front of her with electrical wire. She was completely naked and lay in a pool of blood. It was clear that she was dead. The men fled the room while trying to shield David from fully seeing the horror of his little sister's body, and they all ran from the building. Gustav Fourie ran to summon police as the other men sat outside the building in silence, tears running down their cheeks in the dark. From this point, it's vital that we keep in mind that this was the 1960s. There was nowhere near the level of forensic knowledge in existence that we have today. So although a lot of the actions that were taken might seem outrageously irresponsible to us, police at that time were very much working within their scope of training and technically did nothing wrong according to the protocol that existed at the time. As Gustav managed to flag down the first police officer he spotted, radio calls went out through the group of officers, and senior officers and detectives began to move toward the old Freddy's South building. There, they found the three men who'd remained behind, and from the expressions on their faces, it was clear that what they'd seen in the building wouldn't leave them for a very, very long time. It wasn't only police officers that initially entered the building that night. There were a few members of the public at first too. Gustav accompanied the officers to show them where they'd found Petro's body, and then he left the building, unable to stay there any longer. In the period that followed, police carefully scoured the building. Beside Petro's body, they discovered a pile of clothing. This would later be identified by their family members as the clothes that Petro and Issie had been wearing when they'd left for the swimming pool. Officers searched each and every room methodically, and eventually, downstairs in a walk-in fire-safe room with a very heavy door, which none of the initial searchers had thought to check, they found the body of Issie Fourie. Issie had been bound with the same electrical wire as her cousin. She was also naked, and both girls had been shot in the head. Issie had been shot twice, and Petro had been shot once. Evidence collection at the scene was a monumental task. Given the severity of the case, senior officers wanted anything that could be vaguely related to the case to be collected. So much detritus had been left around the building over the years that it was difficult to know what was evidence and what was rubbish, so pretty much everything was collected. Photographs were taken of the bodies in situ, as well as of the strange scribblings on the wall. Any tire tracks outside had unfortunately been demolished, as dozens of police cars descended upon the scene. Shoe prints inside met the same fate, except for a few which also told a tale in itself. In a cubicle which held a toilet, the window had been broken out, and distinct shoe prints were visible on the lid of the toilet, which was down, and on the cistern, which seemed to have been used as a stepping point to get out of the window. This made police wonder whether the person or persons who had killed Petro and Issie had been disturbed and needed to make a hasty escape. They surely had not entered the building through that window with two captives, so it seemed strange that they would flee out of there and not through the same way they'd entered. Although the prints were laid over one another, it appeared that there may be 3 distinct patterns, indicating possibly 3 perpetrators. In addition to this evidence, it also seemed strange to police that the girls could have been controlled by one perpetrator, unless they had somehow been unconscious. Among the rubbish laying in the corner of the room Petro was found in was a hair comb. These were still the days when men carried combs around, often in their sock, and this one seemed quite unique because it had the initial B scratched into its surface. This was bagged along with everything else as evidence. As the police worked, the 4 men who'd made the horrendous discovery began to slowly make their way back to the Nel home. They were accompanied by an officer who was about to deliver the news that would completely change the Nels, Fouries, and Fouchiers forever. The news of the discovery of Petro and Issie's body hit every member of each family incredibly hard, and for the next hour or so, only muffled sobs and pervasive shocked silence filled the house. It did not seem possible that these 2 young girls, children, who had been so full of life and the promise of a happy future just hours before, were now dead, savagely murdered. Soon, grief would begin to turn to anger, though, and desperation to catch whoever had done this. Police, too, knew very well that they were going to be under intense scrutiny to catch the perpetrators. Times were pretty different back then, and although now there's a distinct separation between the press and police, in the 1960s, journalists were called by police to advise them of the incident, and some members of the press even got access to the scene to take photographs. Those pictures, haunting in their black and white shades, would appear beside the next morning's front page headline: "Cousins murdered. Manhunt for killers." In the hours between the horrific truth being uncovered and first light the next morning, Issie Fourie had received a telephone call in Zambia, telling him that his daughter was dead. He collapsed at the news, and his colleagues quickly arranged for him to be booked on the next flight from Zambia to South Africa to be with his family. Nel, who was still away from home for a friend's funeral, recalls getting a phone call in the middle of the night, telling her to pack her things and be ready. Her father was coming to pick her up. Years later, she says she doesn't quite recall being told that her sister and cousin were dead, but she's sure she was. She only remembers lying in the back of her father's car as he drove back to Odendalsrus, sobbing. I had the privilege during research for this case of being able to access newspaper articles that the family had kept from the 1960s. And it was honestly such an odd experience to see how a case such as the murder of Petro and Issie was reported on back then. In some ways, the journalists pulled no blows. There was little in the way of the accounting for the trauma of families or careful wording of statements. But in other ways, the articles were careful to tread around issues which may seem morally questionable for the times. Strange, small things like referring to someone as an individual's female friend rather than their girlfriend, which they clearly were. And of course, whenever there was reference to any form of sexual assault, the words used were very representative of the time. Words like molestation and inappropriate conduct. I also found it very interesting that immediately police said they were specifically looking for a sadist. Now, the word sadist means a person who derives pleasure, especially sexual gratification, from inflicting pain or humiliation on others. And they weren't just using this word to describe the psychology behind the crime. They were actually using this to describe the person they were looking for, like it was a label that described a person in a literal sense. I found that fascinating. And again, we have to understand where we were as a country and a society when it came to understanding and investigating crime at that time. This was a full 10 years before the Behavioral Analysis Unit was set up in the United States. And of course, that's not to say that we hadn't already started to try and understand the psychology behind the criminal mind, but the ideas about violent criminals, and especially sexually motivated crimes, were nowhere near as advanced as they are today. And it showed. And around that time, it showed in other areas too. Convictions, sentences, and parole releases. If you think we're lenient on criminals today, think again. Yes, I know we had the death penalty back then, but there were often very strange mitigations considered, which could easily save perpetrators from that sentence. And the prison sentences outside of that harshest penalty, especially for crimes like rape, were really pretty paltry. And there was also little understanding of serial offender behaviour. Again, we were 10 years away from the phrase serial killer becoming commonly used, and we certainly had very little understanding at base police level of how someone who might have committed a crime such as the murders of Petro and Issie might operate, and how they may well have done this before. With that said, considering the tools available to them, police went on to carry out one of the largest investigations in the history of the Northern Cape. Autopsies were conducted on Petro and Issie, and the reality of how savagely they had been treated became clear. Both Petro and Issie had died from gunshot wounds to their heads. The caliber used had been a .22, but they'd also sustained other injuries, bruises and lacerations, and both girls had clearly been violently raped. Severe injuries to the girls' genitals suggested the possibility of a rape by more than one offender, or perhaps even a foreign object. There were bite marks on Issie's body. One bite, so vicious, the skin had almost been ripped off completely. While much of the degree of the heinousness of the sexual assault was softened to the family and kept out of the press, police now understood that they were looking for at least one, possibly more than one, very violent rapist and murderer. Looking back at these autopsies now, I can't help but wonder how much more information could have been gleaned from the procedure with the technology we have today. Certainly in a time long before DNA would be used in any crime in South Africa and even the world, investigators could never have fathomed that the secret to the identity of the perpetrators lay in the biological material they'd left behind. Semen and even saliva from the bite marks held the key to slightly lessening the pain of several families. But the tools simply did not yet exist to harness that. At this time, forensic blood typing was already in use across the world. ABO blood typing was the first, more crude method of ruling a person in or out of a crime by virtue of the biological evidence left behind. But this required knowing a suspect's blood type, and could be incredibly hit and miss. The physical evidence that the police could use at that time included fingerprints they'd lifted from the scene, ballistics from the bullets that had killed the girls, if they could find a weapon to compare them to, the shoe prints on the toilet lid, and the bite marks left on Issie's chest and shoulders. Bite marks were starting to be used as evidence in court at that time. And while it hadn't really taken off in South Africa yet, and today it's pretty much seen as a very poor form of evidence, police would take everything they could. Other than that, police in the 1960s relied on hard, slog, physical police work. And in the months that followed, they did a huge amount of that. Very soon after the murders, police announced that they would be offering a 1,000 Rand reward for information that would lead to the conviction of Issie and Petro's killers. Thousands of leads poured into the hotline set up, and a task team of detectives ran down each and every one. 2 particular leads seemed to provide important information. One was that a passerby believed they'd spotted the girls getting into a vehicle which contained 3 men. And the other was that on the same day the girls had been murdered, there'd been several incidents of what was termed sexual deviance in the town of Odendalsrus. From the rather stepping around the issue language of the time in articles I read, I took this to mean that girls and women in the town had witnessed a man exposing himself to them, and some had been grabbed at and made to feel fearful. When news about the initials which had been scrawled on the walls broke, police also received a call claiming that Petro Nel had occasionally asked to be called Yvonne. While this would explain the YN initials on the wall, Petro's family flatly denied that their daughter had ever used a name other than Petro. This wasn't the only inference that came in which seemed to try and attack the girls' characters and allude to them being involved in what would have been illicit activities at the time. A friend of Issie's who'd lived in Bloemfontein, or at least someone she thought was a friend at the time, had given the media a letter she'd written to him in the months before she died. In the letter, Issie expresses in the rather typical over-dramatization of a teenage girl that if she didn't hear from her friend soon, she would die. Issie's family was irate when the newspaper published the letter, and I think rightfully so. It is a very odd thing to do, and really just a completely unnecessary invasion of a victim's privacy with something completely unrelated to the case. During that time, it was also clearly a way of saying these girls were interacting with boys. A completely untrue, victim-blaming insinuation. In among the investigation and the intense media pressure, the Fouries, Nels and Fourie families prepared to lay Issie and Petro to rest. After deciding that the girls would be buried side by side, their dads spent several days building a metal frame which they would place over their graves. The Nel family had experienced their daughter Magdal's grave being damaged and desecrated over the years, and wanted to avoid this happening to Petro and Issie's graves. The funeral of Issie Fourie and Petro Nel would become one of the biggest Odendalsrus had ever seen. More than 500 people arrived to pay their respects to the murdered girls, and the procession to the gravesite was almost 2 kilometers long. The families were still in deep shock, and each member was processing it differently. Years later, Poppy recalled being made to kiss her cousins goodbye as they lay in their coffins. She hadn't wanted to, but tradition of the time had left her with no choice. Her main memory around that day was a sense of dread, and how cold her cousins' cheeks were. Very soon after the girls' murders, some members of the Nel and Fourie families had begun to suspect one of their own. It was a suspicion that would change the life of the accused and his family and all of those to come in that lineage forever. I mentioned earlier in this episode that Issie Fourie had never really been a big fan of his brother-in-law Gustav Fourie. when the girls were murdered and Gustav was among those who found their bodies. Plus, with the location being so close to his cattle kraal and him refusing to allow his own daughter to accompany the girls that afternoon, the man was soon under heavy suspicion. Just 2 days into the investigation, Gustav's own gun, a .22 caliber, was taken in for testing to compare to the bullets found at the scene. It was quickly discounted as the murder weapon and returned to Gustav. After some questioning and checking his alibi with his youngest daughter and his staff member at the cattle kraal, Gustav Fourie was no longer a suspect for police. But that didn't mean the cloud of suspicion within the families lifted off of him. If Gustav had not already felt like an outsider and persona non grata in the extended family, he certainly did after the murders. And that feeling would not go away for many years to come. More than 100 suspects were questioned in the months after the girls' murders. A few arrests were made too. Each time, the family's hopes were lifted and then dashed. One of the most seemingly significant arrests was of a young man who'd confessed to friends that he had killed Petro and Issie. He was arrested in Durban and transferred to Odendalsrus. Soon, though, it became clear that the young man was living with significant mental health conditions. He'd been released from a psychiatric facility not long before he'd made the claims, and he was readmitted after that for the foreseeable future. Psychiatrists there and police would later determine that his confession had been false and had resulted from delusions he suffered with as a result of his mental health conditions. As more information had come in, police had asked for anyone who'd seen a hitchhiker being picked up around 9 p.m. that night to call in. They believed this man may have been linked to the group in the car that had allegedly picked up Petro and Issie, because the witness who'd seen that happened to also have said that one of the individuals appeared to have red hair. That vehicle was believed to have what at the time were Transvaal number plates and could have been a grey or white Volkswagen. Despite all of these leads and an intense investigation, the first anniversary of the girls' murders came and went with no concrete progress. The Nel, Fourie and Fourie families each experienced this tragedy in different ways, and the immediate impact on each family was clear. There had been no justice for their girls, but they still had to do life. They still had to go to work or school every day, deal with the stares from people in Odendalsrus, and the never-ending questions. Somehow, they would need to find a middle ground in order to move forward in this new normal that had been thrust upon them. The community of Odendalsrus was equally impacted, with no perpetrators having been identified. Suddenly, the neighbours they had previously interacted with in a friendly manner were eyed with suspicion. The killer could well still be among them, and no one was safe until he was caught. The children of the town were under lockdown from their parents, their previously carefree lives ripped away. Because if Petro and Issie could be taken while doing nothing other than enjoying a trip to the swimming pool, then everyone's child was at risk. The Fourie family was impacted by the suspicions against Gustav. Despite him having been cleared by police, members of the family and community still treated him as though he'd gotten away with something. This isolation and unfair judgment caused Gustav to start drinking heavily. And although Max tried to help her husband get out of the vicious cycle of alcohol abuse, she eventually also began to buckle under the pressure of defending her husband to the rest of her family, and also began to drink heavily. The baby that Max was pregnant with at the time the girls had been murdered was named Petro Nel, a tribute to her fallen cousins. Poppy recalls how life was never the same after the girls died, not only because everyone had suffered this great tragedy, but because it seemed impossible to move forward from it when suspicious eyes so often watched her father. It's likely that Gustav also internalized some of the guilt that had been so unfairly laid on his doorstep. He was, after all, so close to the girls in proximity when they'd been murdered, and he'd had absolutely no idea. The Nel family remained in Odendalsrus. 2 years after the girls died, Petro's grandparents, who'd lived in a granny flat at the back of their property, also passed away. The poison of suspicion continued to move through the family members, and living in the same town the murders had happened in, regularly had the Nels looking at specific people they thought might be the murderer. One such incident happened a few years after the murders, when Henning spotted a man standing at Petro and Issie's graves. He was a local doctor, and Henning immediately wondered whether he had anything to do with the crimes. Police never did find anything to link the man to the crime, but that did not stop the family from wondering. Dries and Issie Fourie moved back to Zambia for a few years after the murders, perhaps finding it too difficult to be in Odendalsrus after their plans to move back there had gone so badly wrong. The other member of the Fourie family, though, Andre, had perhaps experienced some of the deepest changes in his life because of the murders. The young man had felt incredible guilt over the fact that he'd not been there that day to collect his sister and cousin. Sometimes, in moments of deep pain, his mother directed her anger at him too, reminding him that he'd failed to do what he was asked that day. Of course, none of this was Andre's fault. He was a 15-year-old boy, and he did what 15-year-old boys do. And regardless of whether they'd had someone walking with them or not, Petro and Issie should have been safe. Andre, though, could not rid himself of the guilt and anger he felt. And so he decided to do something about it. Up until the point that the girls were murdered, Andre had been planning to study medicine. He wanted to be a doctor. Afterwards, he changed his career trajectory. Andre Fourie enrolled in police college. If he could not turn back time and change the mistake he felt he'd made, then he would ensure that he could put himself in a position where he would figure out who had done this. He would later say that on the day of the funeral, he'd stood at his sister's grave and vowed that he would find her killer. In the years to come, Andre Fourie would take that vow very seriously, and his decision to become a police officer would make all the difference in the world to Petro and Issie's case. And that is the end of the first part of this episode. In the next episode, we travel forward 2 decades, and then more, and witness, in stark reality, the ripples that violent crime sends through generations of families.